The room went silent the moment the doors opened, and Alina Whitmore felt every eye turn away from her, just as they always did. She stood near the window at the county assembly, her hands pressed together, trying to disappear into the curtains behind her. Her mother's words from that morning still rang in her ears. "No man will ever want you, Alina. Look at yourself. You are too plain, too quiet, too ordinary to be chosen by anyone worth having." Alina had heard this warning 100 times before, yet it never lost its sting. She glanced across the crowded hall, watching the other young women laugh and twirl their fans, their confidence wrapped around them like fine silk. She had none of that. She had only the small, tired hope that tonight would pass quickly and quietly, as it always did. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat nearby, her eyes sharp and watchful, ready to catch any sign of foolishness in her daughter. Alina had learned long ago not to hope for much. Hope only led to disappointment, and disappointment only led to her mother's cold reminder that she had been right all along. The musicians began to play, and couples moved toward the center of the floor. Alina stayed rooted where she stood, counting the minutes until she could slip away unnoticed. She had done this so many times that she barely felt the sting of being overlooked anymore, or so she told herself. Then the doors opened again, and this time the entire room seemed to hold its breath. A tall man stepped inside, dressed in a manner that spoke of wealth far beyond anyone in that hall. Whispers rushed through the crowd like wind through dry grass. It was Nathaniel Ashford, the Duke of Camden. No one understood why a man of his standing had come to such a modest gathering, in such an unremarkable corner of the county. The young women straightened their backs and lifted their chins, each one certain that his attention would soon fall upon her. Alina felt her mother's grip tighten around her arm, a silent command to stay still, to stay small, to not draw attention to herself in the presence of such a man. She did not need the reminder. She had never expected attention from anyone, let alone a duke. She watched him move through the room, greeting guests with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for something or someone. Alina lowered her gaze, certain his search had nothing to do with her. She reached for her shawl, ready to retreat toward the quiet corner where she always waited out the evening. But when she looked up again, her breath caught in her throat. The Duke was no longer speaking with the cluster of eager young women near the fireplace. He was walking directly toward her, his steps steady and unhurried, his eyes fixed on hers as though no one else in the room existed at all. Alina's heart pounded so loudly she feared he might hear it. Surely this was a mistake. Surely he meant to pass her by and greet someone standing behind her. But he did not stop walking. He did not look away. And for the first time in her life, Alina Whitmore did not know what to expect next. Alina stood frozen as the Duke came to stop directly before her, close enough that she could see the calm certainty in his expression. He gave a slight bow, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good evening," he said. "I do not believe we have been introduced." Alina opened her mouth, but no words came. Her mother, standing just behind her, made a small sound of disbelief, quickly swallowed and hidden behind a tight smile. Alina forced herself to speak, giving her name in a voice barely above a whisper. The Duke smiled, as though her name pleased him more than any title or fortune ever could. He asked her to dance. The words landed so unexpectedly that for a moment Alina thought she had misheard him. Around her, the room had gone quiet again, this time not from awe of his arrival, but from shock at his choice. Whispers rose like smoke, drifting from one guest to another, each one wondering why a duke would choose the quiet girl by the window over any of the more polished, more confident women in the hall. Alina wondered the same thing herself. She glanced at her mother, half expecting a sharp word or a firm hand pulling her back. Instead, Margaret Whitmore stood rigid, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet fury, as though the Duke's request had somehow insulted the natural order of things. Alina did not wait for permission. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she made a choice entirely her own. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. The music began, and Alina moved through the steps with a stiffness born of nerves rather than skill. The Duke, however, seemed unbothered by her uncertainty. He guided her gently, his voice low and warm as he spoke, asking about her family, her interests, the small details of her ordinary life that she had never imagined anyone would care to know. Alina answered carefully at first, waiting for the moment he would grow bored and excuse himself. That moment never came. As the dance continued, Alina found herself studying his face, searching for some hidden motive, some trick or jest she had not yet uncovered. She found none. His attention remained steady, his questions genuine, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that unsettled her more than any coldness ever could. She was not used to being seen. She was used to being overlooked, dismissed, measured, and found lacking. Yet here, in this moment, she felt something she had never felt before. She felt noticed. When the dance ended, the Duke did not simply bow and walk away as she expected. He remained beside her, speaking a while longer, ignoring the curious glances thrown their way by the other guests. Alina's mother approached at last, her voice tight with forced politeness as she inserted herself into the conversation, clearly hopping to steer the Duke's attention elsewhere. He remained unmoved, his focus returning again and again to Alina, as though her mother's presence barely registered. Before he departed that evening, the Duke asked if he might call upon Alina again. She managed a small nod, still uncertain this was truly happening to her. As he walked away, the whispers around the hall grew louder, filled with questions no one could answer. Alina barely heard them. She stood in the center of the room, her heart still racing, wondering if perhaps everything her mother had told her about herself had been wrong all along. That night on the ride home, Margaret Whitmore said nothing for a long while, her silence heavier than any of her usual criticisms. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and certain. "Do not let this turn your head, Alina. Men like the Duke do not choose girls like you. Whatever this was tonight, it will not last. Enjoy it while it does, because it will end. And you will be left exactly where you began." Alina turned to look out the carriage window, watching the dark countryside pass by, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder if her mother might finally be mistaken. In the days that followed, Alina tried to convince herself that her mother was right. The Duke had likely danced with her out of simple courtesy, a passing kindness soon forgotten once he returned to his grand estate and his circle of far more suitable companions. She busied herself with her usual tasks, tending to her mother's needs, mending linens, reading quietly by the fire, determined not to hope for anything more. Yet each time a carriage passed on the road outside, her heart quickened despite her best efforts to remain calm. 3 days later, while she stood browsing the shelves of the small village bookshop, a familiar voice greeted her from behind. Alina turned to find the Duke standing there, his expression bright with genuine pleasure at the unexpected meeting. He explained that he often visited the shop when traveling through the county, though Alina suspected the timing was no accident at all. They spoke for nearly an hour, discussing books, ideas, and small observations about the world that Alina had never shared with anyone before. He listened as though her thoughts truly mattered, as though her quiet nature was not a flaw to be corrected but a quality worth understanding. Over the following weeks, the Duke found reasons to seek her out again and again. He invited her to walk through the gardens of a mutual acquaintance, where they spoke freely, away from the watchful eyes of the village. He sent a letter, delivered by his own hand rather than a servant, filled with warmth and curiosity about her life. Each small gesture chipped away at the walls Alina had built around herself over years of her mother's discouragement. She began to wonder if perhaps she had been wrong about herself all along, or if her mother had simply never wished to see her clearly. Margaret Whitmore did not share her daughter's growing hope. With each visit, each letter, her warnings grew sharper and more frequent. She reminded Alina constantly that men of high standing rarely married for genuine affection, that his interest would fade once the novelty wore off, that Alina would only humiliate herself further by believing otherwise. Alina listened to these warnings with a heavier heart each time, caught between the safety of her mother's certainty and the unfamiliar lightness she felt whenever the Duke was near. One afternoon, as Alina sat with him in the garden, he asked her directly why she seemed to doubt herself so deeply. Alina hesitated, unsure how to explain years of quiet diminishment without sounding foolish or ungrateful toward the mother who had raised her. Eventually, she spoke honestly, describing the words she had carried since childhood, the certainty that she was unworthy of real affection. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression softening with something close to sorrow. When she finished, he told her plainly that everything she had been taught to believe about herself was untrue, and that he intended to prove it, however long it took. Alina returned home that evening changed in some quiet, unspoken way. For the first time, she began to question not the Duke's intentions, but her mother's insistence that she deserved so little. The doubt that had once protected her now felt like a weight she was no longer certain she wished to carry. She did not yet know how to challenge the voice that had shaped her entire life, but she sensed that a change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. And somewhere beneath her fear, a small, unfamiliar feeling began to grow. It felt, unmistakably, like hope. The crisis arrived without warning, carried into the Whitmore household on the tongue of a neighbor eager to spread gossip. Word had spread through the county that a rival family, envious of the Duke's growing attention toward Alina, had begun spreading cruel rumors about her character, suggesting she had schemed and manipulated her way into his notice. The story twisted further with each retelling, until it bore little resemblance to the truth. Margaret Whitmore heard the rumors before Alina did, and rather than defending her daughter, she used the moment as proof of everything she had warned against. "You see now," her mother said, her voice sharp with something close to satisfaction. "This is what comes of reaching above your place. People will not simply allow a girl like you to rise without punishing you for it. Better to end this now, before the humiliation grows worse." Alina sat in silence, stunned not by the rumors themselves, but by her mother's readiness to believe the worst of her without question. For years she had accepted her mother's harsh words as protection, a hard truth meant to shield her from disappointment. Now, for the first time, she recognized them for what they truly were, a reflection of her mother's own fears, not her daughter's worth. When the Duke learned of the rumors, he came to the Whitmore home immediately, his expression calm but resolute. He addressed Margaret directly, stating plainly that he had chosen Alina's company because of her honesty, her intelligence, and her quiet strength, qualities no rumor could diminish. Margaret attempted to argue, insisting that Alina would only bring further shame upon herself by continuing this connection. It was in that moment that Alina finally found her voice. She stood, her hands trembling but her tone steady, and told her mother that she would no longer accept being told what she was or was not worthy of. She reminded her mother of years spent shrinking herself to avoid disappointment, years spent believing she deserved nothing better than quiet invisibility. She said she was tired of living inside her mother's fears instead of her own life. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at her daughter as though seeing her clearly for the first time, uncertain how to respond to a version of Alina she had never allowed to exist before. The Duke remained quietly beside Alina throughout the exchange, offering no interference, only steady support. When Margaret finally left the room without another word, Alina felt neither triumphant nor entirely at ease. She felt, instead, unburdened, as though a weight she had carried since childhood had finally been set down. The rumors continued to circulate for a while longer, but the Duke addressed them directly among his acquaintances, refusing to allow falsehoods to stand unchallenged. Slowly, the gossip lost its power, fading into the background as new stories took its place. In the days that followed, Alina noticed a change within herself. She no longer flinched at her mother's occasional sharp remarks, no longer measured her worth by the standards Margaret had set so many years before. She found herself speaking more freely, laughing more easily, allowing herself to hope without immediately preparing for disappointment. The Duke's steady presence remained a comfort, but Alina understood now that the true shift had happened within her, not because of his title or his attention, but because she had finally chosen to stop believing the voice that told her she was unworthy of good things. The proposal came not with grand spectacle, but in a quiet moment in the same garden where they had spent so many afternoons together. The Duke spoke plainly, telling Alina that he had watched her navigate doubt, cruelty, and her own fears with a quiet courage he had rarely seen in anyone, regardless of rank or fortune. He said he had not chosen her out of pity or impulse, but because he recognized in her a strength that had gone unseen and unappreciated for far too long. He asked if she would marry him, not as an act of rescue, but as a partnership between equals who had each recognized something rare in the other. Alina did not answer immediately. She thought of her mother's years of warnings, the countless reminders that she was too plain, too quiet, too ordinary to be chosen by anyone. She thought of the frightened girl who had stood by the window at the assembly, certain she would remain unnoticed forever. And she thought of the woman she had become in the months since, a woman who had finally learned to speak for herself, to demand honesty from those around her, to recognize her own worth without waiting for someone else to grant it to her. She accepted his proposal not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had finally chosen herself. The wedding took place quietly, attended by those who had come to know and respect Alina for who she truly was, rather than the version her mother had always insisted she must become. Margaret Whitmore attended as well, her manner subdued, her sharp words replaced for once by an uncertain silence. Alina greeted her mother with kindness rather than resentment, understanding at last that her mother's harshness had come from her own fears rather than any true reflection of Alina's worth. In the months that followed, Alina settled into her new life with quiet confidence. She continued to visit the village often, unwilling to abandon the simple pleasures and honest connections she had always valued. She spoke with young women in the county who reminded her of her former self, offering them gentle encouragement rather than the discouragement she had once received. She often thought back to that night at the assembly, the night she had expected to be overlooked as always, and marveled at how completely her life had changed since. Alina understood in the end that the greatest transformation had not been her rise in title or fortune, but the quiet, steady realization that she had always been worthy of more than she had been taught to believe. The Duke had seen her clearly from the very first moment, but it was Alina herself who had finally learned to see her own worth just as clearly. And in that recognition, she found a peace far greater than any title could ever provide.